Everyone, happy Monday. It is June 8th. What we are going to be doing is we are going to be reading chapters 35 to 38 of Holes. In these chapters, you're going to respond to a Flipgrid and do my assignment right here. They're pretty short. I just want to make sure that you are catching up with everything and getting things done as quickly as you can because next week is actually the last week of school, which is crazy. So we have 2 more weeks left. So that means we have to finish the book and watch the movie in 2 weeks. So if you have any questions, come to office hours, let me know. And let's begin. Chapter 35. Zero's face looked like a jack-o'-lantern that had been left out too many days past Halloween, half rotten, with sunken eyes, a drooping smile. "Is that water?" he asked. His voice was weak and raspy. His lips were so pale that they were almost white, and his tongue seemed to flop around uselessly in his mouth as he spoke, as if it kept getting in the way. "It's empty," said Stanley. He stared at Zero, not believing that he was real. "I tried to bring you the whole water truck, but," he smiled sheepishly, "I drove it into a hole. I can't believe you're—" "Me neither," said Zero. "Come on, we gotta get back to camp." Zero shook his head. "I'm not going back." "You have to. We both have to." "You want some sploosh?" Zero asked. "What?" Zero shaded his eyes with his forearm. "It's cooler under the boat," he said. Stanley watched Zero crawl back through his hole. It was a miracle that he was still alive, but Stanley knew he would have to get him back to camp soon, even if he had to carry him. He crawled after him, and he was able to squeeze his body through the hole. He thought he never would have fit when he first got to Camp Green Lake. He'd lost a lot of weight. As he pulled himself through, his leg struck something sharp and hard. It was a shovel. For a second, Stanley wondered how it got there. But then remembered that Zero had taken it with him after striking Mr. Pandansky. It was cool under the boat, which was half buried in the dirt. There were enough cracks and holes in the bottom of the boat, now the roof, to provide light and ventilation. He could see empty jars scattered about. Zero held a jar in his hand and grunted as he tried to unscrew the lid. "What is it?" "Sploosh!" His voice was strained as he worked on the jar. "That's what I call it. They were buried under the boat." He still couldn't get the lid off. "I found 16 jars. Here, hand me the shovel." Stanley didn't have a lot of room to move. He reached behind him, grabbed the wooden end of the shovel, and held it out to Zero, blade first. "Sometimes you just have to," Zero said. Then he hit the jar against the blade of the shovel, breaking the top of the jar clean off. He quickly brought the jar to his mouth and licked the sploosh off the jagged edges before it spilled. "Careful," Stanley warned. Zero picked up the cracked lid and licked the sploosh off as well. Then he handed the broken jar to Stanley. "Drink some." Stanley held it in his hand and stared at it a moment. He was afraid of the broken glass. He was also afraid of the sploosh. It looked like mud. Whatever it was, he realized, it must have been in the boat when the boat sank. That meant it was probably over 100 years ago. Who knew what type of bacteria might be living in it? "It's good," said Zero, encouraging him. He wondered if Zero had heard of bacteria. He raised the jar to his mouth and carefully took a sip. It was warm and bubbly, mushy nectar, sweet and tangy. It felt like heaven as it flowed over his dried mouth and down his parched throat. He thought it might have been some type of fruit, perhaps peaches. Zero smiled at him. "I told you it was good." Stanley didn't want to drink too much, but it was too good to resist. They passed the jar back and forth until it was empty. "How many are left?" he asked. "None," said Zero. Stanley's mouth dropped. "Now I have to take you back," he said. "I'm not digging any more holes," said Zero. "They won't make you dig," Stanley promised. "They'll probably send you to a hospital like Barf Bag." "Barf Bag stepped on a rattlesnake," said Zero. Stanley remembered how he'd almost done the same. "I guess he didn't hear the rattle." "You think he did it on purpose," said Zero. "You think?" He took off his shoe and sock first. Stanley shriveled as he tried to imagine that. "What's Maryaloo?" asked Zero. Zero concentrated hard. "Maryaloo. I have no idea." "I'll show you," said Zero. He crawled back out from under the boat. Stanley followed. Back outside, he had to shield his eyes from the brightness. Zero walked around the back of the boat and pointed to the upside-down letters. Maralu. Stanley smiled. Mary Lou. It's the name of the boat. Mary Lou, Stanley repeated, studying the letters. But I thought the Y made a Y sound. It does, said Stanley, but not when it's at the end of the word. Sometimes Y is a vowel, and sometimes it's a consonant. Zero suddenly groaned. He grabbed his stomach and bent over. Zero dropped to the ground. He lay on his side, and his knees pulled up against his chest. He continued to groan. Stanley watched helplessly. He wondered if it was the sploosh. He looked back toward Camp Green Lake. At least, he thought was the direction of Camp Green Lake. He wasn't entirely sure. Zero stopped moaning. His body slowly unbent. I'm taking you, said Stanley. Zero managed to sit up. He took several deep breaths. Look, I got a plan so you won't get in trouble, Stanley assured him. Remember when I found the gold tube? Remember, I gave it to X-Ray, and the warden went crazy making his dig because she thought X-Ray found it. I think if I tell the warden where I really found it, she'll let us off. I'm not going back, said Zero. Well, you've got to go you've got nowhere else to go, said Stanley. Zero said nothing. You'll die out here, said Stanley. Then I'll die out here. Stanley didn't know what to do. He had come to rescue Zero and instead drank the last of his sploosh. He looked off in the distance. I want you to look at something. I'm not. I just want you to look at that mountain up there. See that? See that something sticking out of it? Yeah, I think. What does it look like to you? Does it look like anything? Zero said nothing, but as he studied the mountain, his right hand slowly formed a fist, and then he raised his thumb. His eyes went from the mountain to his hand, and then back to the mountain. That's the end of chapter 35. All right, so one thing I want us to think about here is we found Zero. He's not in very good shape. He's dehydrated, he's sick, he's drinking this stuff that's under a boat that he found. One thing that I want us to think about is the peaches. Whose boat do we think this might have been? Think about that. Whose boat would have been full of peaches at Camp Green Lake? Also, again, we're going back to the mountain with the thumb. It's going to be a very important thing here in chapter 36. They put 4 of the unbroken jars in the burlap sack in case they might be able to use them. Stanley carried the sack. Zero held the shovel. I should warn you, Stanley said. I'm not the luckiest guy in the world. Zero wasn't worried. When you spend your whole life living in a hole, he said, the only way you can go is up. They gave each other the thumbs up sign and then headed out. It was the hottest part of the day. Stanley's empty canteen was still strapped around his neck. He thought back to the water truck. He wished he had at least stopped to fill up his canteen before running off. They hadn't gone very far before Zero had another attack. He clutched his stomach, and as he let himself fall to the ground, Stanley could only wait for it to pass. The sploosh had saved Zero's life, but it was now destroying him from the inside. He wondered how long it would take before he too felt the effects. He looked up at the big thumb. It didn't seem any closer than when they first started out. Zero took a deep breath and managed to sit up. Can you walk? Stanley asked Zero. Just give me a second, Zero said. He took another breath, then, using the shovel, pulled himself back onto his feet. He gave Stanley the thumbs up sign and they continued. Sometimes Stanley would try to go for a long while without looking at the thumb. He'd make a mental snapshot of how it looked, then wait maybe 10 minutes before looking again, to see if maybe it was closer. It never did. It was like chasing the moon. And if they ever reached it, he realized, then they would still have to climb it. I wonder who she was, said Zero. Who? Mary Lou, said Zero. Stanley smiled. I guess she was a real person on a real lake. It's hard to imagine. I bet she was pretty, said Zero. Somebody must have loved her a lot to name a boat after her. Yeah, said Stanley. I bet she looked great in a bathing suit, sitting on the boat while her boyfriend rowed. Zero used the shovel as a third leg. 2 legs weren't enough to keep him up. I gotta stop and rest, he asked after a while. Stanley looked up at the big thumb. It still didn't look any closer. He was afraid if Zero stopped, he might never get started again. We're almost there, he said. He really wondered which was closer, Camp Green Lake or Big Thumb. I really just have to sit down. Just see if you can go a little. Zero collapsed. The shovel stayed up a fraction of a second longer, perfectly balanced on the tip of the blade. Then it fell next to him. Zero knelt, bent over with his head on the ground. Stanley could hear a very low moaning sound coming from him. He looked at the shovel and couldn't help but think he might need to now dig a grave. Zero's last hole. And who will dig a grave for me? He thought. But Zero did get up, once again flashing a thumbs up. Give me some words, he said weakly. It took Stanley a few seconds to realize what he meant. But then he smiled and said, R-U-N. Zero sounded it out to himself. Run. Run. Run! Good. F-U-N. Fun. The spelling seemed to help Zero. It gave him something to concentrate on besides his pain and weakness. It distracted Stanley as well. The next time they looked up at Big Thumb, it really did seem closer. They quit spelling words when it hurt too much to walk. Stanley's throat was dry. He was weak and exhausted, yet, as bad as he felt, he knew that Zero felt 10 times worse. As long as Zero could keep going, he had to keep going too. It was possible, he thought. He hoped that he didn't get any of the bad bacteria. Zero hadn't been able to unscrew the lid. Maybe the bad germs couldn't get in either. Maybe the bacteria were only in the jars which were opened easily, the ones he was now carrying in a sack. What scared Stanley the most about dying wasn't his actual death. He figured he could handle pain. It wouldn't be much worse than how he felt now. In fact, maybe at the moment of his death, he would be too weak to feel pain. Death would be like relief. What worried him the most was the thought of his parents not knowing what happened to him, not knowing whether he was dead or alive. He hated to imagine what it would be like for his mother and his father, day after day, month after month, not knowing, living on false hope. For him, at least, it would be over. For his parents, the pain would never end. He wondered if the warden would send out a search party to look for him. It didn't seem likely. She thought she didn't send anyone back to look for Zero. But no one cared about Zero. They just destroyed his files. But Stanley had a family. She couldn't pretend he was never there. He wondered what she would tell them, and when. What do you think's up there? Zero said. Stanley looked at the top of the mountain. Probably an Italian restaurant, he said. Zero managed to laugh. I think I'm going to get a pepperoni pizza and a large root beer, said Stanley. I want an ice cream sundae, said Zero, with nuts and whipped cream, bananas, hot fudge. The sun was directly in front of them. The thumb pointed up toward it. They came to the end of the lake. Huge white stone cliffs rose before them. Unlike the eastern shore where Camp Green Lake was situated, the western shore didn't slope down gradually. It was as if they had been walking across the flat bottom of a giant frying pan, and now they had to somehow climb up out of it. They could no longer see the Big Thumb. The cliffs blocked their view. The cliffs also blocked the sun. Zero groaned and clutched his stomach but remained standing. I'm all right, he whispered. Stanley saw a rut, about a foot wide and 6 inches deep, running down a cliff on either side. Let's try there, he said. It looked to be about a 50-foot climb, just straight up. Stanley managed to hold the sack of jars in his left hand and slowly moved up from ledge to ledge, crisscrossing the rut. At times, he had to use the side of the rut for support in order to make it to the next ledge. Zero stayed with him somehow. His frail body trembled terribly as he climbed the stone wall. Some of the stone ledges were wide enough to sit on. Others stuck out no more than a few inches, just enough for a quick step. Stanley stopped about 2/3 of the way up on a fairly wide ledge. Zero came alongside him. You okay? Stanley asked. Zero gave the thumbs up. Stanley did the same. He looked above him. He wasn't sure how he'd get to the next ledge. It was 3 or 4 feet above his head, and he didn't see any footholds. He was afraid to look down. Give me a boost, said Zero, and I'll pull you up with my shovel. You won't be able to pull me up, said Stanley. Yes, I will, said Zero. Stanley cupped his hands together, and Zero stepped in his interwoven fingers. He was able to lift Zero high enough for him to grab a protruding slab of rock. Stanley continued to help him from below as Zero pulled himself onto the ledge. While Zero was getting himself situated, Stanley attached the sack to the shovel by poking a hole through the burlap. He held it up to Zero. Zero first grabbed a hold of the sack, then the shovel. He set the shovel so that halfway of the blade was supported by the rock slab. The wooden shaft hung toward Stanley. "Okay," he said. Stanley doubted this would work. It was the only thing for him to lift Zero, who was half his weight. It was quite another for Zero to try to pull him up. Zero grabbed hold of the shovel as he climbed up the rock, using the sides of the rut to help support him. His hands moved one over the other up the shaft of the shovel. He felt Zero's hand clasp his wrist. He let go of the shaft with one hand and grabbed the top of the ledge. He gathered his strength for a brief second and seemed to defy gravity as he took one step up the wall. With Zero's help, he pulled himself the rest of the way over the ledge. He caught his breath. There was no way he could have done that a few months ago. He noticed a large spot of blood on his wrist. It took him a moment to realize it was Zero's blood. Zero had gashes on both his hands. He had held onto the metal blade of the shovel, kept it in one place while Stanley climbed. Zero brought his hands to his mouth and sucked up his blood. One of the glass jars had broken in his sack. They decided to save the pieces. They might need to make a knife or something. They rested briefly and then continued up. It was a fairly easy climb the rest of the way. When they reached the flat ground, Stanley looked up at the sun, a fiery ball balancing at the top of the big thumb. God was twirling a basketball. Soon, they would be walking in the long, thin shadow of the thumb. Chapter 37. "We're almost there," said Stanley. He could see the base of the mountain. Now that they were really almost there, it scared him. Big Thumb was his only hope. If there was no water and no refuge, then they'd have nothing, not even hope. There was no exact place where the flat land stopped and the mountain began. The ground got steeper and steeper. And then there was no doubt that they were heading up the mountain. Stanley could no longer see Big Thumb. The slope of the mountain was in the way. It became too steep to go straight up. Instead, they zigzagged back and forth, increasing their altitude by small increments every time they changed directions. Patches of weeds dotted the mountainside. They walked from one patch to another, using the weeds as footholds. As they got higher, the weeds got thicker. Many had thorns, so they had to be careful while they were walking. Stanley would have liked to stop and rest, but he was afraid that they'd never get started again. As long as Zero could keep going, he could keep going too. Besides, he knew they didn't have that much daylight left. As the sky darkened, bugs began appearing above the weed patches. A swarm of gnats hovered around them, attracted by their sweat. Neither Stanley or Zero had the strength to try to swat them. "How are you doing?" Stanley asked. Zero pointed his thumbs up, then said, "If a gnat lands on me, it'll knock me over." Stanley gave him some more word. "Bugs," he spelled. Zero concentrated hard. "Boogs." Stanley laughed. A wide smile went across Zero's sick and weary face. "Bugs," he said. "Good," said Stanley. "Remember, if it's a short U and there's no E at the end. Okay, here's a harder one. What about Lunch? Lunch. Suddenly, Zero made a horrible wrenching noise. He doubled over and grabbed his stomach. His frail body shook violently, and he threw up, emptying the stomach of sploosh. He leaned on his knees and took several breaths, then he straightened up and kept going. The swarm of gnats stayed behind, preferring the contents of Zero's stomach to the sweat on the boy's face. Stanley didn't have any more words, thinking that he needed to save his own strength. But about 10 or 15 minutes later, Zero said, "Lunch." As they climbed higher, the patches of weeds grew thicker, and they had to be careful not to get their feet tangled in the thorny vines. Stanley suddenly realized something. There hadn't been any weeds on the lake. "Weeds and bugs," he said. "There's got to be water around here somewhere. We must be getting close." A wide, clown-like smile appeared across Zero's face. He flashed the thumbs-up sign and then fell. He didn't get up. Stanley bent over. "Come on, Zero," he urged. "We're getting close. Come on, Hector. Weeds and bugs. Weeds and boogs." Stanley shook him. "I've already ordered your hot fudge sundae." He said, "They're making it right now." Zero said nothing. All right, this is going to be our last chapter, 38, our last chapter for this little mini lesson, but they're in a tough spot. We're really approaching the climax here. Stanley is now going to have to do something to help Zero, who seemingly has passed out and is sick and cannot get up. So let's see how this goes. 38. Stanley took hold of Zero's forearms and pulled him upright. Then he stepped down to let Zero fall over his right shoulder. He stood up, lifting Zero's worn-out body off the ground. He left the shovel and the sack of jars behind as he continued up the mountain. Zero's legs dangled in front of him. Stanley couldn't see his feet, which made it difficult to walk through the tangled patches of weeds and vines. He concentrated on one step at a time, carefully raising and setting down each foot. He thought only about each step and not the impossible task that lay before him. Higher and higher he climbed. His strength came from somewhere else inside him, and he also seemed to come from outside as well. While focusing on Big Thumb for so long, it was as if the rock had absorbed his energy, and now acted like a magnet pulling him toward it. After a while, he became aware of a foul odor. At first, he thought it came from Zero, but it seemed to be in the air, hanging heavy all around him. He also noticed the ground wasn't steep anymore. As the ground flattened, a huge stone precipice rose up in front of them, just barely visible in the moonlight. It seemed to grow bigger with every step they took. It no longer looked like a thumb, and he knew he'd never be able to climb it. Around him, the smell became stronger. It was the bitter smell of despair. Even if he could somehow climb Big Thumb, he knew he wouldn't find any water. How could there be water on top of a giant rock? The weeds and the bugs probably survived only by an occasional rainstorm, like the one they'd seen from camp. Still, he continued toward it. If nothing else, he wanted to at least reach Thumb. He never made it. His feet slipped out from under him, and Zero's head knocked hard against the back of his shoulder, and as he fell and tumbled into a small, muddy gully. As he laid down in the muddy ditch, he didn't know if he'd ever be able to get up. He didn't know if he'd even be able to try. He had come all this way just to... You need water to make mud! He crawled along the gully in the direction that seemed muddiest. The ground became gloopier. The mud splashed as he slapped the ground. Using both his hands, he dug a hole in the soggy soil. It was too dark to see, but he thought he could feel a tiny pool of water at the bottom of his hole. He stuck his head in the hole and licked the dirt. As he dug deeper, and he did so, more water seemed to fill the hole. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it with his fingers and then with his tongue. He dug until he had a hole that was about as deep as his arm was long. There was enough water for him to scoop out of his hands and drop on Zero's face. Zero's eyes remained closed, but his tongue poked out between his lips, searching for the droplets. Stanley's dragged Zero closer to the hole. He dug, then scooped more water out and let it pour into Zero's mouth. As he continued to widen the hole, his hands came across a smooth, round object. It was too smooth and too round to be a rock. He wiped the dirt off and realized it was an onion. He bit into it without peeling. The hot, bitter juice burst in his mouth. He could feel it all the way up in his eyes. When he swallowed, he felt its warmth move down into his stomach. He only ate half. He gave the other half to Zero. Here, eat this. What is it? Zero whispered. A hot fudge sundae. That is the end of our chapters here. Make sure you do the flip grid and the assignment. Good luck, everyone.